you'll all join with me in wishing Alan Saville a very speedy recovery. I can't possibly attempt to fill Alan's presidential shoes, and I know that we were all looking forward to hearing the fruits of several decades of his scholarship on the earliest prehistory of Scotland. But I can at least share with you the results of a remarkable international research project into these exquisite axeheads of jadeitite and other Alpine rocks. If we can have the lights down a little bit, that's lovely. Thank you. So this evening, I'll be transporting you across Europe and back in time at least 6,500 years to the magic mountains of the North Italian Alps, where axeheads like these magnificent specimens, these green treasures, were being made and moved right across the continent. But first, we need to ask the question, why was so much effort expended on making axeheads? Weren't they just tools for chopping down trees and working wood? And the answer is a resounding no. That may well have been the primary function of axes as a tool, but they occupied a much bigger role in our early farming societies as an iconic object connected with clearing the forest in order to create places to live and to cultivate the land. As such, it's likely that a whole mythology grew up around them, and that is why we can see a difference between so-called workaday axeheads like one like this, and the exquisite so-called ceremonial axeheads, such as this one, which was made from flint and was never intended to be used to chop wood. So it's rather unfortunate that the people who found it in Craigentinney in the 1990s decided to do just that, causing the damage that you see. The most dramatic examples of such non-utilitarian special axeheads are the ones which we now know came from the Alps, such as the selection that you see here, which all happen to come from the borders. The three on the left are of jadeitite, and the one on the right is of omphacetite, all from Mont Viso in the Alps. The one that had been in a smithy in Lauder may well have been kept there to bring good luck, and again the chips in the blade may well have been suffered in the smithy itself. Contrary to Victorian folklore, which said that it was a thunderbolt which had fallen from the sky, we now know that it started its life around 1,800 kilometres from where it ended up, and it was probably several centuries old when it was deposited in or near Lauder. So let's see how we come to know this and how this axehead managed to make its incredible journey around 6,000 years ago. It's all thanks to Projet JADE, a wonderful €1 million international research project funded by the French government that was dedicated to the study of Neolithic Alpine axeheads. This project was pan-European in scope, which was the only way that you could really address this question. It was administered by the University of Besançon, and it was led by the most amazing, inspiring axeman extraordinaire, Dr. Pierre Pétréquin. And I was lucky to be on the international team of participants as coordinator for Britain, Ireland, the Isle of Man, and the Channel Islands. And I remain on the team for the current follow-up project, JADE, which is focusing on Southern and Eastern Europe. The project has been published in lavish colour in 2 huge volumes that came out in 2012. So, what was Projet JADE all about? Well, it set out really to locate the source areas where the stone had come from and thereby to answer a problem, solve a problem that had taxed people for over a century, using non-destructive analysis to pinpoint where the stone for each individual axehead had originated. Also, they wanted to understand how you make these things. What was the process of manufacturing them? Very importantly, they wanted to document and map the distribution of these things and create a comprehensive database of all Alpine axeheads over 14 centimetres long. They chose that because there are so many of these things on the continent that it would have taken years more to do every single one. Although within Britain and Ireland, we have so few, relatively speaking, that we insisted that they cover every single one, which is what they did. And also to establish, this is rather a grand term, a typomaterial chronology. All that simply means is what shapes of axeheads were made from what kinds of material at what time in prehistory. And also, most importantly, to put it all together, to understand how these things were used and what was their significance and meaning to Neolithic societies around 5000 or indeed 5500 to 2500 BC. Now, there has been a widespread, long-lived belief in the magical power of jade. The Spanish word for jade, ijadas, is also the word for your kidneys, yeah, your sides. And nephrite, the origin of nephrite, is linked to the term for kidneys. And if we look around the world, we'll see that jade, in its broadest term, which actually encompasses jadeitite and nephrite, has played a very important part in many different societies. So in ancient China, for example, the character for jade was the one that linked the emperor or the ruler between the world of the gods and the world which we inhabit here. And jade was the means by which the emperor had his divine power. It was a token of immortality. And there on the bottom left, you see a prince dating to around 400 BC, who is buried in this magnificent suit of jade. And the funny little things at the front are plugs for every orifice in the body, in order to make sure that this prince's essence would live forever. And we're all familiar with the Maori use of punamu, nephrite, for heitikis or for other things. And so it has significance in terms of the ancestors. And indeed, even in Victorian Scotland, there was a belief in the magical power of this material to solve waterworks problems. So this magnificent specimen here was actually perforated and mounted in silver and worn by a member of the army, just about down here, because he must have had some waterworks problems. Whether it worked or not, we don't know. But clearly there has been a very long history of interest and research into these beautiful objects, which in Scotland goes back to around 1700 AD, when the Maxwell Stewart family must have come across one on their large estates, and they made this beautiful carrying case for it around 1700. And we can see that there are various illustrations and descriptions from the 1800s onwards. These were one of the favourite objects for antiquaries. And a lot of speculation about the sources. So originally people thought, oh, this must come from China, because jade comes from, all jade comes from China. But there was a French geologist called Auguste Damour who said, actually, if you were to go to the Alps, and if you were to go to Mont Viso, in the high Alps, I think you will find the source of this material there. And peculiarly, he was ignored for many, many years, for about a century. But actually, we know he was absolutely right. The British archaeologists and geologists seem to have been obsessed by axeheads in general. So there's a very long, very noble history of research, not just into Alpine axeheads, but all stone axeheads, going right the way back to the early 1930s. So in 1949, when Piggott and Powell published the example that was found at Cairnholy, they were able to put together this distribution map of 50 finds. And then in 2012, the number had more than doubled to about 117. But as you can see, the concentrations are about the same. These things were not evenly distributed around the country. Instead, you get concentrations in East Anglia, southern coast, and a fair old scattering in Scotland as well. Also, British research featured various attempts to try and pinpoint the source of the material. And a lot of this work was destructive. So petrological thin sectioning involved taking a saw and slicing a bit off. I mean, something which we would never allow to be done nowadays. And you can see there that little fragment from Cairnholy has had 2 slices taken out of it. So at least they were able to say petrologically, yes, indeed, this is a jadeitite. They also tried other techniques, chemical compositional techniques, but still, as late as the 1980s, they weren't able to pinpoint the source. And on the continent, geologists there said, well, actually, if you look at the Alps, there are these torrent beds. So the various torrents from the high Alps will bring a lot of material, a lot of big cobbles down and deposit them lower down. And therefore, these people, they must have been sensible. They would have got this stuff from the torrent beds. However, Pierre and Anne-Marie Pétréquin, who had done a lot of ethnoarchaeology in Papua New Guinea, had another thought about this, because they did wonderful work with the last surviving makers of stone axe heads. We know that as soon as steel became used in Papua New Guinea in the 1960s, the production of stone axe heads plummeted. And basically the source of power for the older generation of men plummeted as well, because they weren't able to maintain their monopoly over this mysterious material. By observing where they went, obviously they use everyday stone for making everyday axe heads, but they also go to the high mountains which are associated with the gods and the ancestors. It's just men. It's absolutely taboo for a woman to touch one of these things. And in fact, if a woman touches one, you have to cleanse it by rubbing pig fat over it. And there they go up for these sort of camping trips, and they set fire against the stone, and they bring back down these large thermal flakes, and they work them into these very special axe heads there, the ceremonial axe heads. And in fact, they dress them as women. And they believe that these pieces of stone from these sacred mountains are divinities in their own right, so they treat them as if they are living gods. So the Pétréquins said, okay, I don't believe that they simply got their stuff from the torrent beds. And from 1994 to the present, they systematically went up during the small window of opportunity in the summer months and systematically field walked all of the valleys in the high Alps. And now Pierre Pétréquin must be about 71. He is like a mountain goat. He can trot up these mountains faster than anybody. And so, thanks to their work, they were able to say that the principal sources are Montviso, very close to the French border, to the southwest of Turin, and Montbégois, near Genoa. There is a source of nephrite in the Valais, that's the square that you can see there. This is the kind of territory that we're talking about. And I had the very great privilege in 2009 of going with the Pétréquins on one of their trips. And it was, I had the great privilege also of breaking my arm up there, because you have to be very, very careful, watch every single step. It's not down here. Oh, no, no, no. Here is where you park your car, and you then walk for the best part of a day. And where you get your material is up there, okay? Way up there, way up in the high mountains. And when you are way up there and the clouds come down, you really feel these are magic mountains. These are very, very special areas. And it is quite breathtaking and completely beautiful. The reason I fell over was that we were crossing a river and they said, oh, listen to the marmots. And I looked up with a heavy rucksack and stuff. Be that, it was well worth it. And this is what the raw material looks like. I mean, to the untutored eye, everything is green. So I kept on saying, is this jadeitite? And they said, no, 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 that's serpentinite. But this is a block of jadeitite. And the French call these boudins, because they're the shape of a blood pudding. And they're these huge, maybe hundreds of kilos of pure jadeitite there. And the hard work of the Pétréquins paid off. So that in 2002, that's Anne-Marie there, they found the first evidence for working debris at heights of between 1,800 and 2,400 meters above sea level. I mean, this is really high stuff, very challenging indeed. They found hundreds and hundreds of working flakes. Tragically also, they found that it wasn't just in prehistory that people went and took jadeitite away. There is this awful, awful market for basically jade, and people will do anything, including going there, probably in a helicopter, and they put high explosives there, and they blew up one of these blocks. And that's the reason why they don't give you a very detailed map and say X marks the spot. This stuff is really, really valuable. So one of the aspects of Projet JADE was trying to understand how you work this material. It's very tough indeed, because the minerals are woven together, so it's very hard to work. You can flake it, you can saw it, you can peck it and grind it. If you grind it, It's very slow work. Here you can see where somebody is actually trying to saw a thing, and by experimental work you can remove 1.82 grams an hour using a cord, sand, water, and an awful lot of elbow grease. So in order to make something like this exquisite axe head, which was number 12 in A History of the World in 100 Objects, would take well over 1,000 hours. So, and of course they didn't finish them off up the mountains. No, what they would do would be to go in expeditions, maybe for 5 or 6 weeks. They would camp out on the mountainside, and they would do the initial stages of roughing out, and they would then bring the rough outs back to where they were living much further down and finish them off there. So really, we have to admire the people who made these. And in fact, they've also been able to say that the polishing to this glassy polish didn't necessarily take place when the axe head was finished. Some of the polishing took place in the Morbihan area of Brittany, some of it took place in the Paris Basin. We know that various rocks were used, so it wasn't just jadeitite, it was eclogite, amphasitite, nephrite, amphibolites, serpentinites. Each of them has a different colour and a slightly different texture to it. The reason I'm saying jadeitite rather than jadeite or jade is that jadeite is the mineral and jadeitite is the stone that is composed entirely of this mineral. So I think it's fair to say that before Projet JADE, you could have recognised the light green stuff, but you would really not recognise the dark green or the blackish material as coming from the Alps. The technique that they used was wholly non-destructive, but they were able to calibrate the results against the pre-existing thin section slides and chemical analyses that had been done in the past. So Michel Herrera from the Museum of Central Africa in Brussels used spectroradiometry. He got the idea. This is the material, the equipment that is used in the Mars probe to see if there's water on Mars. And what it does, don't ask me, it's a black box as far as and I've lost my place in my notes, but it pings stuff onto the surface of the axe head, and it gets a sense of the mineral composition, and it produces a spectrum. And what they have done is to analyse over 1,600 axe heads from all over Europe, but also something like 16,000 raw material samples and working flakes in order to build up this magnificent reference collection, whereby any single axe head you are able to compare with 16,000 other results. And it has produced some pretty spectacular results. And I'm pleased to say that this is the most spectacular of all. So this fragmentary axe head that was found somewhere near Pitreavie House in Dunfermline, they were able to say comes from the same block of jadeitite on Mont Viso as 3 axe heads that were found in Germany. I mean, it really doesn't get much better than that in terms of sourcing. Fantastic stuff. What they've also been able to do by putting together all the sources of information on dating, getting radiocarbon dates themselves, etc., is to create, this is their typo material chronology, whereby they can say, okay, the earliest ones were shaped like that, the latest ones were shaped like that, and there was a big increase in the use of this high-quality jadeitite over time, particularly around 4,500, 4,400 BC. And being French, they have imposed a French typology system. So they say this is type Darrington or type Pauillac and all that, and it's good. And they've put together this overall map, which actually extends as far as Istanbul, would you believe? So it goes, what, 1,800 kilometres into the northwest, 1,800 kilometres to the southeast. And they're also able to say that there are some axe heads and some other things that actually must have gone at some point from the Alps to the Morbihan, back to the Alps, yeah? And then possibly further in the southeasterly direction. Amazing stuff. Fantastic. Yeah? Also, they've been able to break it down into time slices so that the very beginnings of use, it was probable that people who would take their flocks to above the tree level for the summer grazing would have come across this material. And so the very earliest ones tend to be, most of them are pretty small and utilitarian and not very far distributed away from the source. So there would be farming communities who live lower down in the Italian Alps who would be gathering this stuff from themselves, for themselves. However, from relatively early on, as probably as early as 4,900, they were making special ones which were travelling quite long distances, including as far as the Paris Basin. And also, they were able to show that the older ones were still circulating at this time. And then the sort of heyday of axehead production was mainly between 4,600 and 4,200 BC. And it's at this point that you get the broadest dispersal of axeheads, including a lot that went to the Morbihan area of southeastern Brittany, where they were able to get the finest, the longest, and they got them reshaped there for a very special elite. They didn't reach Britain and Ireland until around 4000 BC, and the same is true of Denmark and northern Germany as well. And I'll come on to the reasons why that should be so in a little minute. And then there seems to have been a kind of decline in the use of this and a contraction in the circulation area. And the reasons for this are largely because of the upswing in the use of mined flint, particularly in Belgium and France, but also that copper by this stage was becoming very, very popular. But if we dial the clock back to around 4200 BC, our colleague Lutz Classen has formed a very, very interesting map whereby if you look at the east of Europe, the must-have brand new commodity at that time was copper. And they were making copper axe heads that looked like the jadeitite ones, whereas in the west of Europe, it had got to be Alpine jadeitite. So this was a kind of vocabulary of esteem and of power. And there was this interchange, so that some jadeitite axe heads were made to look like the early copper ones and vice versa. Fascinating stuff. And I want to give you two little snapshots of what these things meant at different ends of Europe. So in the Gulf of Morbihan, it was a kind of magnet area for these axe heads from around 4600 BC. If you haven't been there, you've gotta go. This is Karnak, and places like that, you know. The society here was a most remarkable theocratic society, run by men, for a very small number of men. One individual was buried under the Tumulus Saint-Michel in a mound that was so very big that in medieval times they used some of the stones to make a medieval chapel on it. Under this and other huge graves were tiny little chambers, and in these chambers they had not only jadeitite that came from the Alps, including the longest one that's yet been found, 40 about yay big? Wow, big stonking one. Also, you have these little armbands that are made from the same material. And at Manet-Erlec, they found the axe head was actually through the thing in a very, very explicitly phallic thing. Okay, these guys were very big. Mine is bigger and shinier than yours. Say no more. Not only that, we know that these people were good navigators because they were sailing across the Bay of Biscay to acquire fibrillite from northwestern Spain and varisite from northeastern Spain, used to be called Calais, to make, again, there was this fascination with green, you know, green jewellery. And these people were able to kind of hoover up more or less directly from the Alps. How they did it, we have no idea, but it's not impossible that they made the long distance journey to the Alps themselves. Once they got these things, they then decided to change them so that they were unmistakably Morbihanese in their appearance. Okay, so they would have them thinned down for another, 1,000 more hours worth of work. Sometimes they would make the central rib there. Sometimes they would perforate them. And did they wear them? We don't know. But they were so thin that if you held them up to the sun, it would catch the power of the sun. They'd be translucent. And I don't want to be crude, but I do wonder if we're dealing with big swinging dicks, quite literally and metaphorically in every single way. Well, let's remember, these were the guys who were erecting gigantic phallic menhirs here. Okay? Menhirs which subsequently fell. Our French colleagues say it was probably because of earth tremors that they fell, but that people then reused these fragments of these stones in passage tombs, such as here at Gavrinis and La Table des Marchands. And on these stones, they had already had representations of these axes, or axe heads, very often in twins. And that should remind us, do you remember the block that was being sawn into two? So perhaps there was very special mythology about twinning, the twin axe heads. Yeah? And this is part of an incredibly rich mythology of this society, where they also carved cattle and sheep, and possibly sperm whales as well, and birds, and throwing sticks. So it was, you can only guess at the richness of the mythology of these things. Not only that, but we find a pairing in the deposition of these. So it was a British family in 2007 who were out looking for razor clams on the beach at Loroux. And luckily for them, the little boy found 2 pairs of axe heads. And after that, they found they were at the foot of a submerged standing stone row. And there's this lovely little piece of telephone, the father took the pictures of the little son who was going ting ting and trying to sort of scrape the barnacles off these things and say, oh, look, Dad, look what I've got. And they're now on display in the museum in Copenhague. But 2 pairs. Yeah? And this echoes practice elsewhere. So at Vendée in the Oise Valley, you see a big one and a little one that were buried blade uppermost in peaty ground. So there was very much a ceremony, a ritual involved in depositing these things. They were giving these divine objects back to the world of the gods. And for all we know, they may well have said that the blade end is the head and the pointy bit is the feet. We don't know. Meanwhile, at the very other end of Europe, in Varna, the amazing cemetery in Varna, you have the equivalent of today's Russian oligarchs. Incredibly rich cemetery of big men, big in every single way. And again, I'm not obsessed by these things, but they found out that between the man's legs, not only was a new meaning to Goldfinger, was there a sheath, a penis sheath made of gold, and it kind of moves up and down according to the whim of the people who put it on display. There was also an axe head from Montbégois in the Italian Alps. They had got this from about 1,800 kilometres away, and they had reshaped it to look like a copper axe head that was in use at the time in the area. And this is also the earliest use of gold in continental Europe. So here you have this incredibly rich grave. And of course, Alpine axe heads were part of the vocabulary of esteem of these people. So it's a very, very similar, highly stratified, very male, very phallocentric society as the one that we see in the Morpion. And indeed, in Western France, there is a piece of gold, flat sheet gold, that looks just like the gold that you see at Varna. So is it possible that that gold had travelled 1,800 plus 1,800, a long, long way? Yes, it is. So what about Britain and Ireland? When and how did these Alpine axe heads get here? How were they used? What do they mean? And a vital clue comes from the chamber tomb at Cairn Holy, this very simple megalith, which is a translation into stone of a non-megalithic timber mortuary chamber. And although it hasn't been radiocarbon dated, and there's nothing that can be radiocarbon dated from it, nevertheless, it was associated with a kind of pottery, the so-called carinated bowl pottery, which I would put my hand on my heart and say this is around 3,800 BC in date. Also, in the antechamber was a burnt and broken fragment of an Alpine axehead of jadeitite that we know was made in Montviso. And we also know that it would have been several centuries old when it was deposited here. How was it brought? I'm absolutely certain that it was brought by the first farmers, small groups of continental French, I mean what we call French now, farmers who came from different parts of France at different times to different parts of Britain and Ireland. Okay? And it's the 2 strands on the bottom that interest us. So most of the axeheads that we've got probably came through this strand from Nord-Pas-de-Calais up here, and this matches very closely the distribution of these axeheads. And then the rest will have come from a shorter hop documented a movement from Normandy to southwest England. Okay? And that will account for the concentration that we get on the southern coast. Now, these people would have been small in number, but in impact enormous. So they were able to effect a transformation from this way of life that had been lived in Scotland for, well, the whole of Britain and Ireland, for at least 4,000 years, if not much more. A way of life based on hunting and gathering and fishing, to this way of life that was based on producing your own food. These were farmers. So whereas the hunter-gatherer fishers moved around in order to get what was coming into fruition and at different parts, into abundance at different times of the year, with farming you are more tethered. You have to have somebody who will look after the crops. And okay, you might take your animals up to the high pasture for summer, but essentially it's a much more sedentary way of life. And also it means that you have a different relationship with the land. You might have a stronger sense of land ownership. And it wasn't just domesticates that were brought in. We know they must have been brought in because you don't get the wild progenitors of sheep and goats in Britain and Ireland, nor indeed was the process of domesticating cattle and pigs. Did that happen here? So essentially you must have had these imported, and likewise the wheat and the barley and the legumes must have been brought in because you don't get the wild progenitors here. These people also brought a new kind of architecture. So the first few generations would build these vast communal houses until such time as they felt sufficiently established to lay down roots and then bud off into smaller family groups where they would build houses that were about half the size of this. They also brought brand new technology, the technology of pottery making. And of course, they brought with them these ancient, precious heirlooms, which I think were these were the kind of lifeblood, the life and soul of the community. How did they do it? Well, they must have sailed in simple skin-covered boats like this that were still used into the 20th century on the Aran Islands. And although I may have been involved in a very, very heated debate with other archaeologists about whether the prime movers were foreigners, French people, or were the hunter-gatherer communities who brought over the stuff from France. Be that as it may, what we can say is that they didn't bring grown-up animals. You wouldn't want to get into a boat like this confronted by a big bull. No, no, no. You would bring the little babies, so the little calves and the piglets and the little lambikins as well as your seed corn. And a small number of people, they then targeted the best agricultural areas, they found them, they had 1,000 years of farming behind them, so they knew exactly what to do. So they simply tried to reproduce their traditional lifestyle in Britain and Ireland. And if you look at the pottery, you can trace its roots back to the Chassé or Michelsbergoid pottery that was in use in northern France. So an individual axe head might have travelled 1,600 kilometres through the course of its very long lifetime. So over several centuries, it might have started off here, it might have been reshaped in the Paris Basin, it might have circulated around there for quite a while, got there, and then was brought by farmers from France. But in terms of the proximate source, as far as we're concerned, it was parts of northern France from which the farmers came. One very interesting phenomenon is that when Projet JADE involved going to a beautiful place in the Jura called Le Franois, and you cannot fly with these things because they are sharp at one end and pointy at the other end, so it's just too much hassle. So there I was in my red Samsonite suitcase with 27 of these things and 5 pairs of knickers, going on the ferry between Rosyth and Zeebrugge, and when it went through the X-ray machine, they said, oh, but luckily I had a file this thick of permissions and export licenses and all that kind of stuff. When I opened the Samsonite suitcase, our French colleagues said, oh, this is so magnifique. And I said, well, it's normal for us, And what they meant was that actually we have a very high proportion with this glassy polish, much, much higher proportion than on the continent. And I think this isn't a coincidence. I think that if you're about to get into one of those boats with all of your possessions, and the wherewithal to live, on a choppy sea, perhaps sailing, you didn't know where the north of Scotland was. it's a little bit like the genie in the lamp. You know, if you believe these are magic, divine things, and that by giving them a glossy polish, you are enhancing their magical protective powers, therefore you're going to do everything in your power to maximize their protection for you. Interestingly, the black one at the top was found allegedly in a log boat near St Enoch's Church in Glasgow in about 1781. And you can see that there is a band that isn't polished in the middle. And uniquely, for all of the Alpine axe heads, it looks as though this was polished while in its haft, which has been a very clumsy way of doing it, but fascinating. So there you go, cosmic polishing for you. In terms of what shape and size they are, there's quite a variety, although nearly half of them are this beautiful, thin, triangular shape here. And then almost a quarter of them are the type Durrington, after Durrington in Wiltshire. This sort of teardrop, slightly plump shaped. And then there are various other shapes, including some which clearly had passed through the Morpion. So that one there, which is found in Dorset, had spent part of its time in the Morpion where it was thinned and given this polish. That one from High Peak at the top, they started to perforate it just like they did in the Morpion, but they gave up for some reason. And the one that was found beside the Sweet Track, it too had been to Brittany during its life. In terms of what did they do with them when they got here, it looks as if they didn't actually circulate them or keep them for very long. They needed to return them to the world of the gods and the ancestors from whence they came. I mean, these people had no idea where the Alps were, but it's likely that these objects had legends attached to them. These were their green treasures from the magic mountains a long, long way away. And therefore, they have this dangerous power. So you have to give them back to the gods by putting them in watery contexts, by and large. So a quarter of them have been associated with water, including the one from the Sweet Track, which must be one of the best dated axe heads in the whole of Europe. We know that the Sweet Track on the Somerset levels was built 3807 or 3806 BC and was used for a dozen years. Beside this track, placed very carefully, was this beautiful axe head, as well as an axe head made from mined Sussex flint in mint condition. And this must be one of the earliest mined flint axe heads in Britain, and also 2 or 3 different carinated bowl pots. We've also mentioned the one that was found on the River Clyde. And in the River Thames, there are several. Others were found in special places. So 3 of them on a hilltop, or one in a deep valley, one in a rock fissure, one beside the Ebor Gorge in Somerset. And this particular one had been broken and burnt. And they treated them in very special ways. We can tell if you actually drop one of these things, they might be tough, but actually they're quite fragile, and they do smash. I haven't smashed one. But if you want to break it, to form the kind of breakage pattern that we see here, you have to get it and give it a very deliberate bash. So that's how we know that these weren't accidental breakages. These were very deliberate, ritualized breakages. And in some cases, they burnt them as well. And in other cases, they both burnt and broke them. So are we trying to kill them and return them to the other world? That would make sense. And it's a practice that we see on the continent. So not only are the people bringing their way of life, they are bringing their ideology, their mentality, and their myths and legends with them. They also had a big impact. So other people would imitate and emulate them, not only in Britain, but on the continent. So in Denmark, you can see where they had abundant high-quality flint. They would make flint axe heads that were as close as possible to the jadeitite ones. And they would also bury these flint ones just in the same way as the jadeite, with the blade uppermost. Yeah? So this wasn't one that had just been chucked in a pit. We can see it too. So here is just one of several examples of a Durrington-type axe head that was replicated. So the one on the left is Alpine, and the 2 on the right are made from locally available materials in northeast Scotland. The other thing is that a lot of the axe heads made in Britain and Ireland come from mountains, and a lot of them are green. I think this was not a coincidence, that what people were actually trying to do was to recreate this magic green mountain thing. So they had this mythology whereby if you are very, very brave and you go up these dangerous mountains, and heaven knows it really is dangerous going up Pike a Stickle, and and top buttress, you will be bringing a piece of place, to use a term from Richard Bradley, back with you. You go to the sacred mountains that are close to the gods, and you're bringing back this magically charged material with you. Okay? You don't need to go to a mountain to get perfectly good stone to make workaday axe heads, but people bothered to do this. And they made ceremonial axe heads. So on the left, you see a couple of so-called Cumbrian clubs made from the tuff from Great Langdale. On the right, they were using porcelainite that outcrops on Tiefbullia and on Brockley Island in County Antrim. So again, these were not utilitarian everyday axe heads. These were very, very special ones. And similarly, you get these very beautiful flint ones with the glassy polish. These are the only other kinds of axe heads that have got this glassy polish. And there's about a dozen ways of achieving this polish, including rubbing with phytolith-rich plant ash. So we don't know very much about these flint ones because they haven't been found in datable context, but there is this spooky distribution down the east coast of Britain. And it's the same kind of flint that you get in Jutland, but they differ from the Danish ones insofar as they've got this glassy polish and they have a thinner facet on the side. So either it was made in Denmark and exported like Carlsberg, you know, they exported the best for us, or it was made somewhere in Britain. Because we know that that flint actually runs under the North Sea and comes up on the coast of Lincolnshire and Leicestershire. But because there's so much sea level erosion that we're never going to find a manufacturing centre of these things. Finally, Projet JADE threw up some really other, plenty of other very interesting results. So there are several examples of where these things have been reused much, much later. So in the Chalcolithic period, as a metalworker's cushion stone, and this would be a stone that could be used as a hammer or an anvil, particularly if you're working gold. Later still, at a site in the city of London, a Roman site, they found one of these things with a deep, deep groove in it. And this must have been used to run a heavy cord past it because it's such tough material. It would, it'd be very resistant. And they used it so much that eventually it did, run a deep groove into it. Also, it's thrown up long lost friends. And one of our long-lost friends, the late, great Ian Shepherd, was able to tell us that in the Nationalmuseet in Copenhagen, they had this axe head. They don't have it on display, but they occasionally bring it out to play spin the bottle with it because it's so nice and shiny. And they have a note saying it's from Garvock. And Ian Shepherd was able to say, no, it's not Garvock, it's Garvock. Okay. So we had never seen this before. And it turns out that the great Scandinave Vossor came on a grand tour, and he came to Edinburgh, and he bought this axe head from an antiquary in Edinburgh, and he took it back and he gave it to the National Museum in Copenhagen, where it still is. And when it came to Lefranois, I said, okay, thanks, we'll have it back for Scotland then. And they said, don't quite work like that. But it's a proud ambassador for Scotland in Copenhagen. But also, intriguingly, we found some false friends, things which we might have thought, or other people might have thought came from the Alps, but really, really didn't. So on the left, in our own collection, from the banks of the Shannon Island. I don't think so. These are from New Caledonia, on the other side of the world. In the River Thames at Datchet and at Chiswick. At Datchet, again, that's from the New Hebrides, and the one on the right is an absolutely classic Maori adze. This is Punamu. What earth was it doing in the River Thames? And at Datchet, a lot of axe heads have been found, and one is tempted to think that perhaps it was actually somebody's collection of stone axe heads. And when he died, his widow thought, okay, right, well, we don't want to sort of put them on the ground where they might be found by archaeologists who would get confused, so we'll put them in the river, where they then got dredged and found by archaeologists who got duly confused. The other thing we find is that this one here, this little teeny tiny one, about that big, is in the Yorkshire Museum. And over the years, it had acquired a fine spot, Yorkshire. But actually, we know now that it came from a Swiss lake dwelling. And there was a local collector who collected a lot of stuff. And in fact, in the 19th century, when they were digging these lake dwellings in Switzerland and in the Jura, they found so many things that they were playing swapsies. So antiquaries would say, I'll give one to Simon over there, and then he'll give me one of his from one of his sites. And so this is a really, it's a salutary lesson to curators. As time goes by, objects can lose their actual provenance and they can gain false provenances. So we have to be super, super careful in our museum. And you also have to develop a knowledge of ethnographic axe heads as well as archaeological ones from all over the world. It's also thrown up some continuing mysteries. So in the donation box at Elgin Museum is this little type Durrington. What? Unfortunately, nobody knows where it's from. But you see, it's garnered £10, so it must be good. We don't know whether this is another one that came from a Swiss lake dwelling. In Inverurie Museum, they've got at least one or two of these, which I'm pretty sure must have come from a Swiss lake dwelling. So, our work continues to try and sleuth these things out and squeeze the last little bit of information we can out of it. If you want to find out more, it was 120 euros and it sold like hotcakes. But if you go to the museum in Copenhague, you can still find some on sale. It's a fantastic testament to the vision of a truly, truly great archaeologist. And for me, it was the greatest privilege to have been part of Projet JADE, and even more privilege to be part of JADE 2. Lots of fine wine. Thank you very much.